3. In opposition, we have ASD 8. On the motion, this House supports the greater political integration in ASEAN. I invite the Prime Minister to take the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a world today where currently in the news we've seen Duterte, the president of the Philippines, a member of the ASEAN, the chairman of ASEAN currently has already cut ties with the European Union, and we see that these kinds of decisions are already harmful to the rest of the individual developing countries which are members of ASEAN, right? Because we see that it's harm. One of the greatest harms here is that the choice of one becomes the outcome of all, right? We're going to see in the long run how cutting off ties with an economic body as large as the EU is going to harm other countries in the ASEAN. How it's going to harm and we see what's going to happen is that if other ASEAN nations see that their neighbor is explicitly making decisions which are going to be detrimental to everyone's development, then we see that they have the right to retaliate in such a way that they're going to call for a greater political integration, which we want for in this debate, right? Because we see that these kinds of issues, these kinds of problems can be avoided by having more political integration within ASEAN, by having judicial courts, by having judicial courts, an ASEAN parliament, and things like that, right? Because at the end of the day, we see it's ASEAN's responsibility to actually safeguard the development of every developing country, about every developing member of it, right? Because in that way, we can then now try to try for human rights violations in the Philippines in a better way, in a more effective way. We can and even safeguard more political ties, safeguard more economic ties. No, sit down, right? So we see at the end of the day, it's opposition's burden to actually prove to us why development is better when it's purely economic and when you don't exactly focus on political integration with that, right? So with that, I move on to my first argument for that. Okay.
When countries in the ASEAN that already have a sketchy human rights track records try Duterte, what do you think they're going to do about it?
That's not exactly what we're talking about here in this debate. We're talking about generally ASEAN. In ASEAN in general, where they all want to stand for the development of their country, their own respective countries, and the quality of life of the people that they eventually have, right? So at the end of the day, it's going to be a greater will to uphold those human rights, a greater common good, because not all countries have sketchy human rights violations, right? Okay, but then moving on to my first argument on how how greater political integration safeguards greater development, right? Because we see that economics and politics are inseparable, because political policies have economic consequences, such as the example of extrajudicial killings in the Philippines, wherein with the rise of that, many investors pulled out of the Philippines. People didn't want to invest anymore, our credit ratings went down, and things like that, right? Because another example of that is the shift from an alliance to the West to a shift to China, which will eventually have those economic consequences when you choose to neglect more powerful, more economic bodies as you have more established relations with, right? And in the converse, we see that economic policies also have political consequences, right? Because we can see this because economics determines dependency ratios. They can determine the margin of happiness of the people. They can determine the poverty line. They generally determine what kind of lives these people live, right? And at the end of the day, we see that that can affect politics in such a way that it affects voter turnout based on the quality of the economy that the current administration can give to these people and compared to what they want to, right? And or how it can determine the self-actualization of these people, the self-actualization of the country, right? So given that they're inseparable, we see that this contract actually goes on, this contract carries on over to international organizations, to international movements, right? Because if the Philippine economy, because the Philippines economic policies are largely determined by the chairman of ASEAN, determined by the THS, how will it affect these other countries, right? Because we see that there's a problem when you don't actually involve politics to begin with, because we see that economic policies in itself are a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because a self-fulfilling prophecy is when you believe something is bad, and that situation continues to worsen because they continue to think that it's bad, right? Because one example of this can be seen in the Asian economic crisis, where first of all, it started with Thailand's GDP was at an all-time low, and because of that, investors started pulling out of Thailand. But then after that, they then realized that Malaysia's GDP is somehow like Thailand's, so they started pulling out of Malaysia too, right? And even more after that, they started to realize that the Philippines economy is also like Malaysia, and they started to pull out of that as well, right? And the worst part of this is that the countries like the Philippines and Malaysia in this situation didn't really have anything to do with the drop of any direct fault in Thailand's economics at the time, right? So what did that end up with in all three countries? It ended up with poverty rates rising. It ended up making it harder for these people to rise up to further develop their country even more, right? Because we've already told you that due to this self-fulfilling prophecy in economics, it leads to greater political and economic consequences, right? One of the worst harms of this is that the starting point of a country is the direction it will still continue to go, right? Because we see that when it's not as because when we see that when you have crises like that, they force a country to still take a longer time to live with that low quality of life, that low economics, those harder to apply policies, right? And even then we see that even in situations where the effects are not as grave, we see that economics is still a determinant in the way the state goes no matter what. They're going to find ways to adjust their policies to improve the economy and whatnot, right? So, but then moreover, when we get back to the motion, at least on our side, it only gets better. It's the only better way to get things on our side, right? Because we see that these kinds of harms can be mitigated by having judicial courts against human rights or an ASEAN parliament, right? Because that's when you can eventually pursue policies for a common good for all members and not just one. So at the very least, all of the choices, majority of the choices can be agreed upon. It can have a consensus to the benefit and the harms and the trade-offs that they're willing to make and prove for the better well-being of the economy and not hand in hand with those political policies at the end of the day. And I am proud to propose.
It is requested to maintain silence when the speaker is speaking because the acoustic sound very clear. Thank you. I invite the leader of opposition.
This was never a debate about whether or not the ASEAN in and of itself as a political, as an economic entity is good or bad. This was a debate about whether or not we should extend that ASEAN jurisdiction over and above that of just being economic, but on a political aspect. That was the fatal flaw that we got from government side. But moreover, what then is our clash? We tell you that when you extend this towards a political level, there's going to be massive harms towards the economic and the political climate that ASEAN then faces. But before I argue, let's move on to a bit of responses, right? Because what did they tell us? They simply told us that, oh, you're going to get a better human rights record, or you're going to get a better name for ASEAN as a whole, because the ASEAN can therefore try human rights violations, like, for example, trying Duterte. But the fatal flaw of that type of argumentation is they never really characterize who exactly are the members of ASEAN to begin with. Because if you look at their members, there's a fatal flaw in how exactly they're going to try Duterte, because I'm pretty sure they're going to be friends. Because if you look at it, what exactly are the main members of ASEAN? Right? You have the Philippines, who has even in your examples has a sketchy human rights violation record, human rights track record. We have countries like, for example, Malaysia, that's planning and debating on whether or not they should implement things like, for example, Sharia law. You have Myanmar, that's running on a military junta that are examples of human rights violations and examples of how these ASEAN members are not going to be as Western as you think when it comes to trying human rights violations. So therefore, if the only value that they can bring to today's debate is tell us that, oh, when you have a better human rights violations that's brought about by the ASEAN trying Duterte, then that value ultimately falls because we think that it's not likely to happen. But what else did they tell us? They told us that ASEAN can then influence Duterte to not cut ties with the EU. Well, you can't politically influence that type of thing when it comes to the decisions that are solely made by President's mouth, right? Okay, so we tell you that if your main value was, oh, Duterte is now going to shut up, that's not the value that we're willing to accept either, simply because Duterte didn't consult the entire parliament, the entire government, or the entire Philippines about whether or not we wanted to cut ties with the EU. He literally just went on media and said, oh, I'm cutting ties with the EU and I'm not accepting your aid. So therefore, we tell you that that can't simply happen. Right? What else did they tell us? They told us that the choice of one is the choice of all. And they simply justified this by telling us that political discussions will affect the economic aspect. Well, if the ultimate goal was an economic benefit, let me tell you that ASEAN already has current economic platforms to make sure that these economic harms can be mitigated through things like, for example, the fact that it's easier to trade, and trade and economics is something that there are already provisions for. But moreover, let's look at their argumentation. Because there was no example whatsoever of any political decisions made that actually affected the economic life. What they simply told us was, oh, Thailand or Malaysia's economy was low, therefore everybody else's economy was low. That's not a political discussion, that's an economic discussion. But moreover, let's move on to my argumentation because their case ultimately falls. First of all, I'm going to talk to you about how there's a massive political harm, but before that, are there any points? Okay, seeing as there are none, let's set up some precedents. We tell you that things like, for example, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Myanmar are already running on a system of strongman politics. And we tell you that our points of argumentation are going to happen on a spectrum. We tell you that if we are going with the characterization that they want, that everybody is just holding hands and they're saying kumbaya and everybody just agrees with everything, we tell you that there's going to be massive political harm. However, if in the more likely scenario where there are disagreements, we tell you that there are going to be massive pressures and massive strongman politics to actually legitimize the sanctions and make sure that the economic benefit from the EU is something that then becomes less effective. But how do we justify political harm in today's debate? First of all, some characterization, because they never really told us what type of countries really are in this space. But sure.
What then is your platform to ensure that these smaller nations get a voice in this ASEAN strongman political arms race?
Well, what's yours? You simply told us that they're going to have a council, but you never really told us how, if they're a smaller country, they're going to have equal representation within these types of things. Not to mention the fact that stronger countries would likely form alliances, and those things would never happen at the end of the day. Okay, back to the characterization. Massive differences in culture. Unlike the EU, which is something that we see is still failing, there's still massive differences in culture. When in the EU, they're connected and they have similar cultures. But countries in the ASEAN are more made up of islands, where borders were drawn not only by their religion, not only by their cultural differences, but by foreign colonizers who just said, oh, this forms a good shape, let's make that a country. Okay, what does this mean? It means that the type of politics that are going to be used right? We're going to talk about strongman politics, and at the end of the day, it's a massive political harm. Because if you have countries that have a sketchy human rights record, like what we already characterized, like for example, Malaysia, Myanmar, and the Philippines, making decisions and making making a criminal court or trying human rights, and they're for human rights violations, what then becomes is they become to justify the type of human rights violations that then occur. Because the Philippines isn't going to try Malaysia for their human rights record if they have a sketchy human rights record as well. What happens then is that the court decisions that then arise from these type of parliaments, of these type of courts, are things that justify the type of human rights records that happen on their side. But what happens, the big harm here, is that we justify pre-existing human rights violations, and you're more likely to get politicians that adapt to this political climate, and you get more strongman politics. But what's the comparative? On their side, on our side, the only thing that happens is you have a Western influence that doesn't necessarily have ties and have a large stake on influencing you as a state to actually do these things. However, on their side, you have a high stake in the political climate, and you have a high stake in actually limiting the only economic benefit that these countries have there. And let's talk about the imbalance of representation, but then we'll talk about economics. Because what happens then, since there's a massive cultural difference, they're likely to vote for different politics, right? Okay, what happens then is that larger countries or smaller countries aren't represented enough, in a sense that the policies that are happening within their country don't even fit in with the policies required to make sure that their own dominant religion can thrive. What happens then? Is these people are no longer represented in the vast majority of ASEAN discussions, and therefore nothing is going to happen. We saw this in places like, for example, Germany was able to pressure European states, like for example, Austria and Hungary, to accept refugees. These are things that prove that there is an imbalance of representation through the fact that these countries are able to pressure these countries. We tell you that the main reason opposition takes this side is the only way that there can be any positive change on their side is if Singapore dominates ASEAN and is able to impose all their policies. I'm very proud of it.
Thank you. I invite the deputy prime minister.
Opposition side comes up here with two main ideas. First, that these smaller countries are going to die down with the discussion of larger strongman politics. And second, how the cultures of these countries are so different that it's impossible to find common ground. Therefore, we should just abandon this idea of common policies and of greater political integration. But we done it on a first level. We did answer the burden in which we proved why exactly it was so important for political integration to exist. It's because of the fact that countries don't have an avenue in order to get represented at all, and that these countries cannot have a say in what economic policies ASEAN will forward at the end of the day. But they say that, sure, they may have a voice, but that voice gets drowned out. There's an inconsistency in their case, madam. They say that in the status quo, it is enough that these countries are purely economical and that these countries are separate from each other, but then they come here to say that strongman politics dominates the narrative and that weaker countries and smaller countries cannot stand up. But in that on our side, we do get them an avenue to stand up. We get them representation in council that could probably have block voting or weighted votes. We do get them a place on the ASEAN Human Rights Judiciary Board in which they could try those countries with human rights and prove them that they aren't strongman at the end of the day, meaning that all we want to do on our side of the house is provide an avenue in which these countries can actually state their cause rather than just be overshadowed by the greater narratives of strongman politics. But let's formally respond to their second point, right? why they say that there are multiple and massive differences in culture that means that they shouldn't die at all. We say that culture is not at all much of a determinant in the way these countries are represented, or that culture is not a determinant in the way these people necessarily want their politicians. If Christianity or a religion was so dominant in the narrative of Philippine culture, why then is a murderous Duterte in the administration, right? Meaning that sometimes these narratives don't get perpetuated and that status quo is ever changing. We need a political integration that changes with it, that adapts, and they say that this political integration is inflexible. That's not true, madam. But more importantly, this integration will actually allow narratives to be pushed forward, reactions to be pushed forward, and that creates a better discussion at the end of the day. And we tell you that let's assume a spectrum, right? Where our case doesn't happen and their case does. Let's assume that there are countries with strongman politics, there are countries divided on this issue, and there are countries who are underdeveloped. We tell you that in all spectrums, politics is the main determinant on whether or not these countries get to develop at the end of the day, right? But more importantly, these narratives of strongman politics can then be brought to light on a more formal world stage. If ASEAN is backing you up saying that the strongman politics is wrong, that even grants more legitimacy for smaller countries, that when you leave it to ASEAN summit economic conventions and leave it to statements that have little to no value on the political impacts of these other countries involved that don't have the narrative of strongman politics. Let's take a look at those divided on the issue. Those divided on the issue can then understand what both sides stand for and no longer keep waiting for something to happen. And in fact, they can actually understand which side tailor fits to their political narratives and which side tailor fits to their economic narratives. Because they come here with an absolutist value that only strongman politics dominates the narrative. And they say 3 countries out of like 12. There's also Laos, who has actually also shifted to China. There's also Indonesia, who is currently facing bombs in their parliament. So they come here saying, claiming representation without really representing ASEAN. But more importantly, let's go on to the lower end of the spectrum, where developing nations don't have much of a say. We give them a say. We give them a say in which they can further promote their narratives, where they can band together and actually rise up compared to where they're like the middle ground, waiting, in fact, dominated over. So on our side, we got better political integration, better political representation, and better development. But let's go on to my arguments. First, I'm going to argue why exactly it is justified to do so, and secondly, why on a political level this has to occur, right? Oh wait, no. Why on a political level these benefits can only happen on our side. First level, why exactly it's justified? ASEAN, for as long as it was founded, has stood for 2 things: common development, 3 things: common development, common goals, and promote a sense of unity. That's why it holds summits regularly. That's why it wants further diplomatic ties and economic ties and the free flow of goods and services to occur within the Southeast Asian nations within it. And we tell you that if those goals are met, if any policy in ASEAN meets those goals, it is automatically passed. That's why we allow lower barriers to trade to happen in ASEAN, because it promotes a further sense of unity and promotes common goals and common development. And we tell you that political integration actually promotes these things for 3 reasons. First, yes.
How will ASEAN ever be able to follow the human rights that we want when there's no proper example of a clean human rights track record within ASEAN aside from Singapore?
Aside from Singapore, then we try those people with sketchy human rights records too, right? Because the way that the judiciary works it out is you try people with violations, then we're just going to do exactly that. I don't get where they're coming from. But more importantly, we tell you that on the first level, political integration ensures a sense of unity. If you as ASEAN can band together to promote shared culture as Southeast Asia, then we tell you that can actually promote further political integration. Or that you share common economic policies, then that can further promote political integration. Because not only do you realize that your neighbor is also suffering from poverty, then you can help out your neighbor by strengthening your president's talks to each other about uplifting poverty as a whole. Or you can create diplomatic ties that seek to promote common policies to simply uplift poverty in the greater Southeast Asia. So these common narratives within ASEAN actually promote that sense of unity, and that can only be driven through furthering politics, right? But on the second level, this promotes development, because you got an avenue for discussions to occur even better than just summits where businessmen or investors talk to each other, where world leaders can actually sit around on a table and discuss politics. Hey, I believe that EJKs are good, and then Singapore comes up here saying, I believe EJKs are bad. Or let's say Thailand comes up here saying, we don't know where we're on this issue. And then multiple other discussions can take place that only seek to help out the issue at hand. Right? That's why we don't give out statements anymore, because in this world, you have to take a stance in order for your side to develop. And that is actually helpful to development, because now you know what they stand for, you know that they're ever changing, and you know that you can do something as a reaction to help it out. And further, on the third level, why common goals can be achieved. A common narrative and a shared common goal as ASEAN means that they can drive a discussion to a more coherent one, that they can drive a goal to a better one that seeks to benefit everyone through a general policy. Thank you.
I invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition here.
Government side's biggest fault in this debate was they tried to claim the benefits and they tried to claim the effectiveness of a politically integrated ASEAN Union without ever talking about what a politically integrated ASEAN Union would actually look like. They say that these people who actually want to, let's say, not be oppressive or who are against, let's say, things like human rights, bad human rights records, are suddenly going to be represented in a world and in an institution that's usually which is typically and in a majority in support of things which are typically against these human rights records to begin with. In fact, the only idea that he gave to us about how these countries are going to be represented, or this idea of bloc voting and how they're going to form a coalition to actually combat these countries and their own personal interests, well, he never even described to us how many countries actually would have the incentive to have these kinds of interests and how many countries would actually be willing. First of all, I'm going to have a discussion of that. First of all, we tell you that the majority, we tell you that at least a large majority, or at least the majority of countries within ASEAN that are actually powerful have the natural incentive to be against these kinds of human rights, to be against things like human rights and the prosecution of human rights to begin with. I'm going to have a more in-depth analysis. Things like Singapore, if you vandalize a window in Singapore, you're going to be whipped 12 times. Something that's not really representative of what you would see as just punishment if you're thinking of it in the Western sandbox. Things like Myanmar, which have a military junta, which actively oppress the population of Burmese people. Things like Thailand, which have a monarchy, which is something that we already see as undemocratic and underrepresentative. We tell you that as a whole, because of the way that the ASEAN works, there's not going to be any person that you can appoint to actually try this. The kind of conclusion and the fact that he said was the importance of this. He told us that the way we're going to improve human rights is by a council of some kind of a new ICC that's going to be formed within the ASEAN Union, and then this is going to be effective at actually resolving these harms. Why do we tell you that's not going to happen at the end of the day? We tell you that if you're, let's say, ASEAN, who's going to appoint the Supreme Court justices that they're actually going to overrule and preside over these crimes? We tell you that if we're just assuming that the states appoint these kinds of justices, they're obviously going to appoint justices who fulfill their own political agenda. Meaning that if overall the majority of states, and particularly the most powerful states, want to have judges that are particularly lenient to human rights violations, you're never going to have this kind of idea where you're actually going to have these kinds of prosecutions, because they're all going to be complicit in these kinds of damages. Therefore, they wouldn't want to harm themselves even more. The second thing that they talked about was simple. Raymond went on and on about how the ASEAN was supposed to integrate more, and how we were supposed to be culturally integrated, and this is something that's in the interest of the ASEAN Union. Why did he tell you that's not something that's going to happen? First of all, the only analysis that he gave to us was how political integration would make more countries intertwine, and they'd feel shared strife, and then they'd feel how bad other countries would have it relative to Europe. We tell you, first of all, they never actually assumed any, they never actually pressed us with any policy that would ensure these kinds of benefits. Like, what, are you going to reduce the amount of visa costs? Are you going to reduce flight time or subsidize flights? But secondly, we tell you that's not actually the way that we fulfill these goals to begin with. We believe that these goals can be fulfilled through other means, like just regular travel or how our economies are already interconnected and status quo. And thirdly, we even target, is this really a value that we want to protect to begin with? Yeah, sure, the ASEAN countries were supposed to have some kind of integration, but we don't tell you that integration goes to the extent where they have to like tangibly feel how bad another country is. We tell you that it's an integration of economics and how they want to better themselves at the end of the day. So what am I going to discuss? I'm going to discuss to you one thing. I'm going to tell you how political integration is going to be extremely horrible for like economic interests within like the majority of these ASEAN countries. We tell you that the premise is simple. We tell you that ASEAN countries have varying levels of development and varying levels of culture. Meaning that countries like Indonesia and Malaysia have huge economies that have the capability to produce massive amounts of goods at lower prices compared to things compared to countries like Myanmar or Thailand, whose economies are still developing, therefore can't compete. We tell you that you're actually going to try and have an economic hegemon within these kind of countries to begin with. What do I mean by this? Because these countries are still trying to fulfill their own interests, they're going to try and economically strong-arm other kinds of countries to make sure that their own economic interests can be fulfilled. What kind of strong-arming are we talking about here? We tell you that, let's say, sure.
Still, how then do you develop these smaller countries given that you say that we don't have any of them?
Easy. We let these small countries develop by making them on their own, where they can still fulfill their economic policy without the oppression of larger states, which can actually intervene with their own personal economic interest that's going to be detrimental to them. Okay, so how am I going to do this? We tell you that because these states have these major states, let's assume because of their greater population and their greater wealth, have greater representation within, let's say, ASEAN parliament or whatever kind of representation, they never really talked about it. We tell you that when this happens, it's going to be a fundamental part. Meaning that, naturally, they're just going to have more votes, and typically stronger economies are going to promote things that actually try and strengthen their own economies. Things like greater free trade laws, where let's say, if Indonesia starts imposing that it's fundamentally required for you to reduce all tariffs, meaning that countries like the Philippines, which also produce canola oil, but therefore they produce it at a lower price, would therefore bust their own economy because they simply can't compete at it. Or secondly, what they would actually do, or things that are more political, let's say things like the Spratly Islands, which aren't just claimed by the Philippines and China, but actually the majority of ASEAN countries have a stake in, and if they want to lobby and to push their stake within this own kind of politics, the kind of strategy they're going to use is a strategy of political strong-arming and economic strong-arming, saying that, well, if you're going to do this, I'm going to pass a resolution that we're going to tariff your own goods because you're being unruly and unreasonable with the rest of the ASEAN nations. Or if you're trying to impose your own interests within things like increasing the kinds of good prices, or trying to engage in things like market manipulation, we're going to sanction you for that as well, because these states have the active interest to suppress any kinds of competition because they want to claim the hegemony within these kind of states. What we tell you is the fundamental problem with this. We tell you that what you're actually going to do is you're actually just going to have a few states dictating the economic interests of all these other states. And we tell you that what you're actually going to do is you're going to make a society where you're more likely for things like financial collapse. Because if we're only serving the interests of one major state who is significantly more developed than the other states, and the economic policy is particularly catered to them, we tell you that the states that can't compete are going to be forced into economic dissolution, meaning that their economies are going to be weaker. And we tell you that there's a gradient and the really bad things that happen because of the way that we've integrated these countries so much. Because these countries are so integrated, any kind of economic loss or any kind of economic collapse happening on their side, like their example about how the Asian economic crisis started, would fundamentally create a collapse within the entire system as a whole. Because since you interconnected politically, normally when economies collapse, there are ways that you can mitigate that harm by isolating them. But now that you're interconnected politically, they're going to try and use their power to sink the entire ship with them, because now it's going to be like the Greece and the EU strategy, where they're all going to have to keep bailing that country out to make sure that country won't be financially incapable and make sure it won't actually go against the ASEAN Union, which is going to create huge amounts of harm. So with that,
And by the government.
Our goal at government was really simple, that we want the better development for member states of ASEAN because we think that the economy that you have at the end of the day is intersectional and is reliant on what political climate and decisions that these types of countries make at the end of the day. Contrary to what opposition wants to point out to us, we don't think that these member states should be left out and left out to the dust where they somehow try to improve without any analysis as to how that's going to happen. Because we think that if they characterize like strongman politics and things like that, then that means you're only going to trap these smaller countries into a vicious cycle where they have no ability to act out and forward what they want at the end of the day. I'm going to talk about three things to you today. Firstly, how would our world look like at the end of the day? Because there's a deadlock between what they're saying that there's strongman politics and what we're saying it's better for the judicial system. Secondly, I'm going to talk about which actor is the best to do this? Is it themselves or actually ASEAN who's directly accountable for them? And thirdly, we're going to talk about the effects of both sides. If I move on, sure.
If what you then want is economic development, how does that not happen when you have currently installed economic policies? And keep in mind that your side never gives any policy to counter that.
Okay, thanks for segueing me to my first issue, because now I'm going to talk about what our world actually looks like. The first thing they told us is that, you know what, these countries have sketchy human rights violations, and we think that it's absolutist for them to paint it so right. We think it's not the case. And it's their best interest to actually it's best interest for them to not forward their own interests. Firstly, we think that not all countries have sketchy human rights violations, right? But even if that's the case, then sure, we'll try these countries as well, right? But we think how our world looks like when you have these things like the ASEAN Parliament or like the judicial branch or the human rights like organization or things like that. No, thank you. We think when you have judicial powers like these, most likely the people who are going to be in these types of courts are those who are those chosen by are voted into power because they have a better track record, and given that they are professionals at the end of the day, right? Because we think there's a best interest for countries to actually not be able to not have favoritism in these types of courts, because you're talking about economics and politics. And we think that given the characterization that politics affects economics, we think that you're going to be impeding. It's not in their best interest to be impeding the development of both countries at the end of the day. Right? No, thank you. We think that we think that it's less likely for you to appoint justices who are convenient, given that if you are doing so, we think it's less likely for you to appoint justices who are convenient because it's their best interest to develop and things like that, best interest to develop, and that's something you don't get under their side, basically. I'm going to talk about who's the best actor to do these types of things, because look, they seem to paint ASEAN as a hellhole, right? But then if that's the case, and if given the characterization that all countries are strong-armed, even assuming their best, like what they said, we think that if that's the case, then ASEAN would have been a hellhole in economics to begin with. Because, no thank you. Because if they are so strongman at the end of the day, then why hasn't there been trading that solely benefited these countries or benefited only them at the end of the day? So what am I trying to say? We think they're still rational at the end of the day, and we don't think that the strongman policies. We don't think that when it applies to economics, politics still apply here, because they don't want a common downfall where one country affects the decisions of another one, and that leads to another chain reaction of harm, right? So we question their side. How will they develop on their own, and who are the actors to actually forward these types of things? Because when you're talking about leaving them on their own, then that's something that's really harmful, because you're talking because you're talking about the collapse. You're talking about these countries who already don't have the capability to act out, and you're forwarding that further, and that causes then that's something we're not willing to take, because then it's not representative of what they actually want. You'd allow these larger countries to actually take over, like have precedence over what these smaller countries want. Yeah, no, thank you. So we think that the imbalance of representation and having different things is precisely the reason why there needs to be more political integration to begin with, and because we grant them the common interest to actually forward these types of goals. It's not like these countries will want to stay in the hellhole that it's not in their best interest to like. It's not like these countries want to stay in the hellhole that they are in, and we think that it's better forwarded on our side, given that we grant these avenues to them once you have more political integration. They haven't responded to the frame which Gabby said, right? That economics is inseparable from politics. That these political decisions, like for example, having the extrajudicial killings, does affect the economics of not only your country, not only on the ground level, the people, but also the economics of the international community, and especially ASEAN, right? We think that it's more justified for them to pursue it's more justified for ASEAN to pursue these things, given that they are directly affected, directly affecting the member nations of ASEAN, and we think that you only continue to worsen living conditions under their side, their side. So what we're trying to say is that ASEAN should move towards greater political integration first, because there has to be some sort of representation for them at the end of the day, and that's not being forwarded, and a better ASEAN is not being forwarded on opposition.
Thank you. I invite the opposition.
Let's clear this up because it's becoming really messy. Status quo, wherein economic integration with ASEAN is already present, comes with summits, right? Summits which allow like businesses to explore and flowing of goods and services. They characterize this as the lowering of barriers. With economic integration, what you have is the higher barriers, right? Because with this economic integration, it entails implementation of laws, implementation of policies that should be abided by as such higher threshold, as high as a threshold as like a national law. We see in this type of case wherein this affects all of the people within ASEAN, all of the diverse nations and countries, and filled with diverse religions and histories. We see that this is a problem. Wherein with a majority of Protestant or Christian EU, this is different versus the ASEAN, which has a different religions, for example, from Islam, from Christian, from Buddhist majority states. We see that this is a problem.
They believe that when they have the same laws and same policies, they believe that these results to a greater coherence and greater unified ASEAN. This, we believe, is the exact thing that would make them divided. Three issues with this. First, what is the effect to the ASEAN's economic aspects with greater political integration? Secondly, does political integration automatically cause representation? And thirdly, will political integration result to human rights protection, which they were supposed to protect? So let's go to the first one. What is the effect to ASEAN's economic aspects with greater political integration? Because government said that if they influence politics to the better, for the better, right? If they make Duterte somehow more diplomatic, and maybe Narendra Modi from Malaysia is not going to be that controversial, maybe it would influence their economy for the better. But this, we believe, is a burden imposed upon themselves that the pragmatic of political integration should be then better, right? This burden wasn't fulfilled enough because opposition asks, who really is going to be in it? We see that in this type of representation, we're going to have the leaders of the countries, of the people that I already mentioned. And these people have a greater interest in mind, which isn't an ASEAN integration, but the interest of its own country. This, we believe, is a very high harm because we've already told you, coming from opposition, on the high likelihood of these political harms happening with these strongman leadership, which is actually dominating the ASEAN in the same political integration that they want. This also trickles to economic harms because in what they said about weighted votes, we see that the higher votes actually will come from the countries that have higher populations, for example, and higher economies, which doesn't result to the representation that they actually want. Maybe they want like Singapore to actually represent ASEAN, to actually give out those types of diplomatic benefits. But we see that Singapore is like a tenth of the population of the Philippines, and we see that this isn't going to happen in their side. They said then that don't be an absolutist. Maybe Duterte will stop being a dick. Maybe Narendra Modi will stop having these controversial issues, and maybe Suki is isn't anymore gonna actually not protect the Rohingyas. But notice how this is highly unlikely. But even if all of these magical, fantastical things happen, we see that there is still a high likelihood for the collapse of the ASEAN economy, as what our DLO told you, on how these blanket policies and laws is highly gonna affect the economy. This is really harmful. Yes.
You said that politics is ever changing, and we've told you that politics and economics are inseparable, so economics is also ever changing based on different cultures. How then will you ensure that you gain constant common benefits on your side? You say you have.
You don't need politics to gain constant common benefits. As what we see right now with the ASEAN economic integration, we can still have these constant common benefits with the summits that we have, with free-flowing trade and products and services that is happening in our country. We don't need imposing of blanket policies and laws to have these common benefits, because the common goal is economic, is to be able to grow as a nation with its economy. And this concludes that the effect to the ASEAN's economic aspects with greater political integration is actually going to be harmful, wherein the harms outweigh the benefits that are non-existent. So let's go then to the second issue. On does political integration automatically cause representation? Because what we've already told you, weighted votes, that what they have is actually it's actually not going to give them the representation that they need. Because with our side, we say that it is better to be actually reliant on the economic representation that the ASEAN is in status quo is already giving you. Because if not, you won't be actually be able to have that type of representation at all. So it is not good to have political representation. It is better to not have that, because you're not actually going to get that representation of the minorities of the small countries like Singapore actually needs. This concludes then this issue. Third issue, on will political integration result to higher human rights protection? Because this is what the debate is about. This is what the motion calls for, which exactly what government has entirely missed in this debate. They concentrated too much on economic benefits. The motion already called for political integration, which called for human rights protection, which called for the parliament, or called for a council or a ASEAN ICC, right? But we see that this is a missed greater nuance of the motion coming from government. Ken already told you in his speech that there will be a result of an imbalance of power with Western entities such as the ICC and the UN. Because in the protection of human rights, it becomes a battle of legitimacy. If Suu Kyi becomes chairman of the ASEAN, wherein this would actually might lead to a result of the legitimacy of not protecting the Rohingyas. If Duterte is gonna become chairman in their side, it becomes the legitimacy of the EJ case, which the ICC actually wants to try. These types of human rights imposition of Western ideas is actually what they want to impose upon ASEAN is what would lead to the greater collapse and the greater divide of ASEAN. For all of these reasons, we're very proud to lose.
Thank you very much. And while the opposition replies.
Okay, so we talked about three things in this debate. Number one, how can we actually ensure better human rights records for us all? Number two, how can we make sure that we're financially better off as the ASEAN? And number three, what is the ASEAN's true agenda at the end of the day? First of all, we talked about these the human rights record. Government side's agenda was to say that once ASEAN had a governing body that was able to judicially impose things upon its leaders, then it had the capability to enforce their wills upon the general population. But what were we saying coming from opposition? We told you that that's not actually going to happen. Because since the system is already so corrupted, the people who are actually going to be appointing and making the people who are going to be governing themselves are the same people who are committing these human rights records, and they're the same people who are going to commit these crimes. Meaning that you're not going to incriminate yourself, and you're not going to make your own situation bigger. No response. What did we say even that was going to be even worse when it came to human rights records? Our case coming from opposition was simple. It was that you further entrench these people into a capability of safety where now, since the court says, okay, you're completely justified in your human rights atrocities, then they have the capability to defend against institutions like the ICC because they already have some sense of legitimacy. And because they have that legitimacy, they have the capability to go even further because that court already says that these things are no longer wrong and these things are like free will for any state to enforce. Meaning that in this conclusion, they had no capability to prove how these actual human rights are going to be better. And what we did is how they're going to be worse because of the system that they fundamentally create when it's political. Second thing we talked about, financial capability. What was the case? The case was like this. So they talked about how economies are fluent and they always change. Therefore, politics are fluent and always change. And since they're interconnected, if we improve politics, we get to improve economies. First of all, their explanation to prove how politics will be better was just like, well, if we have representation, if we have weighted voting, then we can have more democratic processes. But just because you have democratic processes, does that mean that the political situation will actually be better? Like what we were saying as a response to that is to say that these situations will actually be worse because they had no response to the idea that fundamentally there is differences when it comes to people within ASEAN in itself. So meaning that some ASEAN members are far more represented than other ASEAN members. And they didn't even have any examples about how any coalition could ever overpower the interests of, let's say, Malaysia or Indonesia when they wanted to further their own financial agenda or political agenda. The only thing that they said was, well, once we can have these political situations to improve, we can have economics, which they didn't prove to begin with. What did we say coming from opposition to even fulfill that goal that how the political situation is going to be worse and the economic situation is going to be worse independently? First of all, we said that the political situation is going to be worse because of the strongmanship and how each nation will try to establish hegemony over this kind of institution to try and further their own interests. Because let's say they have the capability to enforce the laws, impose tariffs, meaning that they can strongman deciding within their own political opinion without any response coming from opposition. The only thing that they said, well, Singapore can stand up for itself because maybe we'll give them more votes. Well, unless your idea is that we'll give Singapore 10 votes and we'll give countries like Malaysia and Indonesia 5 votes and 4 votes, which is something that we see it's really ridiculous. But secondly, on the economic aspect, we already proved to you how it's actually impossible for you to have generalized policies with like one ASEAN parliament. Because when you have these kinds of generalized policies, what you do is you actually make it so that some countries can't compete with what these policies are giving to. And since we already characterized that big countries within the ASEAN community can control these politics, it will only be catered to them, and other countries will be in the dust, creating possibilities for financial collapse because of the way these economies are intertwined. Last issue, what is the ASEAN really about? Because government has this really weird analysis about what kind of ASEAN that they want to see, about how they want things like interconnection, where they feel the other countries like strive for something like this. What was a clash coming up from opposition? First of all, we said that was really unsubstantiated and had no place in reality. It's real politics. We want a world where the ASEAN as itself was formed out of an idea of self-interested politics and of the betterment of economic policy and the economies of different countries. So the issue of this is simple. What side can prove which economies and what side will people actually better off? And that side's coming from.
Thank you very much. And where the government will bless you.
The previous speaker comes up here trying to push the extent of their arguments by giving you slippery slopes in that reply, right? But we tell you, Madam Chair, don't listen to those slippery slopes because they were never fully able to understand the incentive and disincentive structure of certain countries in relation to others and how other countries are going to react. We were able to give that to you by saying, number one, on the point of legitimacy. They say that ASEAN courts will now fight for legitimacy with the ICC and the ICJ, and if we elect people like Duterte, what kind of image does that give to you, ASEAN? Well, we were able to give to you a response to all speakers, then they won't elect Duterte. If they see that he's detrimental to their international legitimacy, why would they even put him there? And in fact, we would try him, saying that he's the bad guy here and that he does not represent ASEAN interests. We're able to analyze how ASEAN necessarily acts to certain politics, given that it is ever changing. We're able to tell you that if Duterte suddenly stops being a bad guy, then that's better for everyone. Or if cultures don't necessarily get to be propagated, we understand that, and we want an avenue for discussion in order to say that this is what's happening in our country now, this is what might happen in the future, this is the trend of which it's going, and then that even gives other countries a chance to react and create differences for their own politics, for their own agenda, and for their own economics. So you're able to do that by saying that we got an avenue for representation, and that these smaller countries can create weighted voting or block voting, and that is their incentive to do so. And they even and we tell you that these smaller countries will even grant a better access to discussion rather than on their side, where they just leave it to the dust and leave it to strongman politics, right? And they come to you saying that strongman politics is the dominant narrative in Glasgow today, and then they come to you saying that then we allow these developing countries to just go at it on their own. If strongman politics is the dominant narrative today, that means that they can strongman economics right now, but why are they doing so? Because they understand that the economy is intertwined, and once you strongman a certain country, that country will react, that will cause a downfall of everyone else, even more so if you combine them politically. Because now that they're intertwined to the extent of politics, now that they're intertwined to the extent of common goals, if you try to drag someone down to the act of self-interest, then you will get dragged down because it all comes back to source. My Whip was able to tell you that there is an active disincentive for countries to do because they do not want to get dragged down with failing economies, or to the very least, a country that doesn't at all get represented and that compromises their legitimacy and the legitimacy of their interests, right? But more importantly, they said that financially, that these countries won't prosper if you put them in a roundtable discussion, right? Well, tell you that it's even worse on their side when you leave them be. Because now you leave them be to the whims of self-interest that is unregulated and that cannot be governed or cannot be judged by any independent ASEAN body, right? Because you leave them to the whims of Malaysia, Philippines, and you leave Laos or smaller countries to the whims of these countries, and they cannot do so and call out because then they will be called out on going against the interests of the greater ASEAN. At least on our side, you have representation or given avenue of representation. We never said it was in a snap. We just said that you can get a better avenue for discussion for these smaller countries to act out, for these smaller countries to actually seem more legitimate and seem more rational than those acting out of self-interest. And that is an active disincentive for them, for larger countries to act out of self-interest, and a greater incentive for smaller countries to propagate rational narratives, to propagate good economic policy and good political policy, because to the point of interconnection that comes with an ASEAN political integration, you have to understand that these certain countries' narratives and interests will be forwarded more than others, and we want that not to occur, or we want that to be regulated by everyone else who is affected, by everyone else who cannot consent in the status quo, by everyone else who is forced to bear the brunt of economic policies and political policies in an issue where they do not have representation on their side. That's why we made this statement.